The early morning fog lingered around the towering skyscrapers, creating an eerie stillness in the heart of New York City. Grace Parker, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, stepped out of her sleek black sedan. Her sharp eyes were fixed on the revolving glass doors of her firm's headquarters, a symbol of the power and influence she wielded as one of the city's top corporate lawyers. But today, as she tightened her grip on her leather briefcase, she felt a sense of unease. Something was off. As she crossed the bustling sidewalk, her gaze drifted to a small huddle of people near the corner, a cluster of worn figures wrapped in tattered coats. There, sitting on the ground with her back against the cold concrete, was a woman whose face was partially hidden by the strands of dark curls falling over her eyes. A child, barely more than 6 years old, was curled up beside her. The child's thin arms clutched the woman's hand, her wide brown eyes staring blankly at the crowd of strangers rushing by. For a moment, Grace paused. There was something disturbingly familiar about the woman's profile, the slope of her shoulders, the delicate curve of her jaw. As if in slow motion, the woman turned her head slightly, revealing a face that made Grace's heart skip a beat. "Lily? No, it can't be," Grace whispered, her voice lost amidst the city's noise. It was her, Lily Rivera, the best friend Grace had lost touch with more than a decade ago. They had been inseparable in college, two determined young women striving for greatness. Then after graduation, Lily had vanished without a word. There had been rumors, family issues, a difficult relationship, but Grace never imagined. Why is she here? The question echoed in her mind, louder than the traffic roaring around her. She took a step forward, then stopped, torn between duty and shock. Lily's gaze briefly met hers before she quickly turned away, clutching the child closer. Grace's phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. A reminder flashed on the screen. Board meeting in 10 minutes. Her feet felt like lead as she turned and walked away, but something inside her screamed that she shouldn't leave. Not like this. Before we dive into this fascinating story, please share a comment with the community, letting us know where you're watching from. The meeting was a blur. As the board members droned on about quarterly reports and mergers, Grace's thoughts kept drifting back to that image. Lily, homeless and broken, holding on to that little girl. She couldn't shake the hollow look in Lily's eyes, the haunted expression of someone who had been through the worst life could throw at them. And the child, those sad, desperate eyes, seemed to be pleading for help, for recognition. Unable to stand it any longer, Grace stood up abruptly, startling the room into silence. "I'm sorry," she said, ignoring the shocked expressions of her colleagues. "I need to go." Minutes later, she was back on the sidewalk, scanning the street frantically. The spot where Lily had been was empty. Panic surged in her chest. No, where did she go?" she muttered, turning in circles. After what felt like an eternity, she spotted a flash of dark hair disappearing into a side alley. "Lily," Grace called, breaking into a run. Lily froze, then slowly turned around. Her face, lined with exhaustion and dirt, twisted with a mix of disbelief and fear. The little girl hid behind her, peeking out with those same wide eyes. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, the air heavy with everything left unsaid. I can't believe it's you," Grace finally managed, her voice tight. "What happened? Why are you here?" Lily's gaze dropped to the ground. "It's a long story, Grace. I don't want your pity." "It's not pity." Grace's voice rose, startling the child. She softened her tone, forcing herself to take a breath. "I just want to understand. Let me help you." For a second, Lily looked like she might refuse. Then, glancing down at her daughter, she nodded stiffly. "We'll talk," she murmured, "but not here." In the corner booth of a small cafe, Grace sat opposite Lily, struggling to comprehend the story that unfolded. One tragedy after another, a medical condition that wiped out Lily's savings, job losses, eviction, and through it all, she had no one to turn to. "But why didn't you reach out to me?" Grace asked, pain tightening her chest. "I would have done anything to help." Lily looked away, her fingers tracing the edge of her chipped coffee cup. "You were busy with your own life, Grace. I didn't want to burden you. And there was something else." She hesitated, glancing at her daughter, who sat quietly beside her, coloring in a worn notebook. Grace frowned, leaning forward. "Lily, what aren't you telling me?" The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Finally, Lily whispered, "She's your niece, Grace." The words hit like a physical blow, knocking the air from Grace's lungs. "What?" Her gaze darted to the child, who looked up with those same dark eyes so similar to her brother David's that it took her breath away. "David was her father," Lily murmured, tears glistening in her eyes. "We were together for years, but when I got pregnant, he disappeared. I thought he would come back. I kept waiting, hoping. Then I found out he was killed in a car accident." Grace felt the world tilt. Her brother, her only sibling, the person she thought she had lost years ago, had left behind a daughter, and she had never known. "I don't understand," she stammered, her mind reeling. "Why didn't he tell me?" Lily shook her head, anguish etched in every line of her face. "Your father disowned him when he found out about us. David tried to contact you, but your father intercepted everything. By the time I found out, it was too late." Grace's heart pounded painfully. Her father, his cold, controlling presence lingered even now, years after his death. He had kept this secret, torn their family apart. But why? "I'll make this right," she vowed, her voice shaking. "You and Emma, you're coming with me." Lily's eyes widened. "Grace, I can't." "You will," Grace interrupted firmly, gripping her friend's hand. "Your family." But as they stood up to leave, a shadowy figure appeared outside the cafe, watching them closely. The three of them, Grace, Lily, and little Emma, stood awkwardly in the spacious foyer of Grace's penthouse apartment. The contrast was stark. The high ceilings, polished marble floors, and crystal chandeliers made the place feel like a palace compared to the grimy alley Lily and her daughter had been living in just a few hours earlier. Emma, clutching her mother's hand, stared up in awe. Grace knelt down beside her, forcing a smile as she tried to make herself less intimidating. "Emma, would you like to see your new room?" The girl glanced at her mother, who nodded gently. With a tentative smile, Emma slipped her small hand into Grace's. Grace's heart clenched as she led the girl down the hall, past the walls lined with art and books. She knew it would take time for Emma to feel safe here, but she was determined to do whatever it took. "This is your room," she said softly, pushing open a door. Inside, the walls were painted a soft lavender, with a small bed piled high with fluffy pillows. There were toys, some she had picked up in a hurry, some that had been untouched in the guest room for years. The little girl's eyes widened. "For me?" she whispered. "Yes, sweetie," Grace replied, her throat tight. "All for you." But even as Emma's face lit up with shy delight, Grace could feel the tension radiating from Lily, who stood silently in the doorway. Grace turned to face her, bracing herself. "Lily, you're staying too. You and Emma will live here with me until we figure things out." Lily's lips pressed into a thin line. "I appreciate it, Grace, but..." "No buts," Grace cut in sharply. "You have no job, no home. You don't have to do this alone anymore." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Lily's shoulders slumped slightly, and Grace realized with a pang that it wasn't just pride that made her hesitate. It was fear. Fear of being hurt again, of being abandoned by the people she trusted. "Please," Grace whispered, stepping closer. "Let me be the sister you needed." Lily closed her eyes, her face crumpling. "All right," she breathed. "All right, Grace." But neither of them noticed the shadowy figure lingering outside the building, a dark car parked just across the street, its engine idling quietly. It was nearly midnight when the doorbell rang. Grace, who had just finished tucking Emma into bed, frowned as she made her way to the front door. Who could be visiting at this hour? Peering through the peephole, she felt a jolt of shock. "Mrs. Peterson?" she murmured, swinging the door open. Her family's old housekeeper stood in the hallway, her lined face creased with worry. "Grace, dear, I came as soon as I heard," Mrs. Peterson whispered, glancing around nervously. Grace's pulse quickened. "Heard what?" The older woman stepped inside, lowering her voice. "About Lily and the child. They've been looking for her." "Who?" Grace's voice was sharp. "Your father's lawyer," Mrs. Peterson said in a rush. "They're trying to get custody of the girl." "What?" Grace's mind reeled. "Why would they?" "Because your father left something behind," Mrs. Peterson continued breathlessly. "Some document, some stipulation. They know Emma is David's daughter, and they want control over her." The words slammed into Grace like a punch. Control? Her father was dead. How could he still be trying to manipulate their lives? But Why would they want Emma? What could he possibly gain? Mrs. Peterson's eyes darkened. I don't know, dear, but you must be careful. They're watching. Before Grace could respond, there was a low growl of an engine from outside. She darted to the window just in time to see the dark car speed away into the night. Whoever was in that car, they weren't just watching, they were waiting. The next morning, Grace woke to the smell of coffee and the soft murmur of voices. She found Lily in the kitchen, nervously stirring a cup of tea while Emma played quietly at the table. For a moment, it looked almost normal, like the family they should have been all these years. Morning, Grace said softly, stepping into the room. Lily looked up, her eyes puffy with lack of sleep. Morning, she murmured, glancing at Emma. Did you sleep well? I did, Grace lied. She could still feel the fear gnawing at her stomach, Mrs. Peterson's words echoing in her mind. Lily, we need to talk. Lily stiffened. About what? Grace hesitated, glancing at Emma. Can you go play in your room for a bit, sweetie? Emma nodded obediently and slipped away, leaving the two women alone. Lily, Grace began, choosing her words carefully. Do you know if David left anything behind? A will? A letter? Anything? Lily's face tightened. No, she said flatly. I don't know anything about that. Are you sure? Grace pressed, desperation creeping into her voice. Because if my father's lawyer is trying to take Emma away, there's something we're missing. Lily's eyes flashed with sudden fury. What do you mean? Take her away? No one is taking my daughter, Grace. I don't care what your father wanted. I know, Grace said quickly, reaching out to grip Lily's hand. I know, but we have to be smart. If they think they can get custody, they won't, Lily snapped, yanking her hand away. They can't. Lily, please, Grace whispered. Please just tell me, did David ever talk about anything strange? Anything he wanted to keep hidden? The silence stretched, heavy and dangerous. Finally, Lily lowered her gaze. There was one thing, she murmured, but I don't think it's connected. Grace leaned forward, heart pounding. Tell me, Lily swallowed hard. It's just a name, Rosewood. I don't know what it means, but he used to talk about it right before he left. Said it was the key to everything. Grace's blood ran cold. Rosewood. It was the name of their father's old estate, an estate he had sold off years ago, long before David had vanished. What does it have to do with Emma? She asked slowly. I don't know, Lily whispered. But if they want her, it must be something big. Grace stood abruptly. Then we're going to find out. As they spoke, neither of them noticed Emma, peeking around the corner, her eyes wide and frightened. And somewhere in the city, the shadowy figure in the dark car was making his own plans. The air was thick with tension as Grace navigated the narrow, winding road leading to Rosewood Estate. The afternoon sun hung low, casting eerie shadows across the twisted branches of the leafless trees that lined the path. Next to her, Lily sat rigid, clutching Emma's small hand. The girl's eyes were wide, darting between her mother and Grace, sensing the fear that radiated from them both. What's this place? Emma whispered, her small voice breaking the silence. It's where your grandfather used to live, Grace replied tightly, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. She hadn't been back to Rosewood since she was a child. The estate had been sold off when she was still in college, a move that seemed odd even then. But now, with everything Mrs. Peterson had said, it made an awful kind of sense. Grace pulled up to the crumbling iron gates, which creaked ominously as they swung open. A shiver ran down her spine. She couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible waited for them behind those gates. Are you sure about this? Lily murmured, her face pale. We have no choice, Grace replied, her voice firm. She glanced back at Emma, who huddled in the back seat. Stay close to us, sweetie. We won't be long. The old manor loomed ahead, its once grand facade now dark and foreboding. As they stepped out of the car, the wind howled, whipping through the abandoned estate like a warning. The front door was unlocked. Grace exchanged a wary look with Lily, then pushed it open. The inside was dark, the air thick with dust and decay. Memories flared in Grace's mind, the laughter of her childhood, running through these very halls. But those days were gone. Now, the place felt haunted. What are we looking for? Lily whispered as they crept deeper into the house. I don't know, Grace admitted, but we'll know it when we see it. They searched room after room, but there was nothing, just emptiness and the echo of their footsteps. Just as Grace began to think they were wasting their time, she spotted something strange. A small door, almost hidden behind a heavy velvet curtain. She stepped closer, heart pounding. "Grace, what is it?" Lily asked, her voice tight. Grace's fingers shook as she grasped the handle and pulled. The door swung open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. "We have to go down," she said, voice trembling. "Grace, no," Lily breathed, grabbing her arm. "We should leave." But Grace was already moving. She felt drawn, compelled to see what lay below. Lily hesitated, then sighed and followed, Emma clinging tightly to her hand. The stairs creaked beneath their weight, and the air grew colder as they descended. At the bottom, they found themselves in a small windowless room. It was lined with dusty file cabinets, each drawer labeled with neat, precise handwriting. "What is this place?" Lily whispered, glancing around nervously. Grace stepped forward, her eyes scanning the labels. Property rights, trust funds, estates. Her gaze snagged on one label, Rosewood Holdings. Her heart thudded painfully. "This is it," she murmured, yanking the drawer open. Inside was a single manila folder, thick with documents. She pulled it out, her hands trembling. "What does it say?" Lily pressed, peering over her shoulder. Grace flipped through the papers, her eyes widening with each page. It's everything," she whispered. "The estate, the money, it's all here. And oh my God." Her breath caught as she reached the final page. Lily leaned in, eyes wide. "What is it?" "It's a trust," Grace breathed. "For Emma. My father, he left everything to her, but only if she's in their custody by her 7th birthday." Lily's face drained of color. "That's next week." "They've been waiting for this," Grace whispered, horror dawning. "They need her under their control. If they get her, they'll have access to everything."
Hey there, quick message. Grab a paper, write down HeroKind Stories, our channel name. Come back soon, we've got incredible stories you won't want to miss.
Before they could react, the sound of footsteps echoed from above. Grace spun around, eyes wide with fear. "Someone's here," she hissed. "Quick!" Lily grabbed Emma, shoving her behind an old cabinet. "Hide!" Grace slipped into the shadows just as the door at the top of the stairs swung open. A figure stepped into the room, a tall, imposing man with a stern face and cold eyes. Grace's heart lurched. "Mr. Daniels," she whispered. Her father's old lawyer stepped forward, his gaze sweeping the room. "I know you're here, Miss Parker," he called softly. "You shouldn't have come." Grace stepped out of the shadows, squaring her shoulders. "Why are you doing this?" she demanded. "Emma is just a child," Mr. Daniels smiled thinly. "She's more than that, Grace. She's the key to your father's empire. The trust ensures that whoever controls Emma controls Rosewood and everything your father left behind." "That's insane," Grace shot back. "My father's dead. None of this should matter." "Your father planned for every contingency," Mr. Daniels replied calmly, "even his own death. He knew David would fail him, and he knew you would never follow his wishes. But the child, she's still moldable, controllable." "Over my dead body," Lily spat, stepping forward. Mr. Daniels' eyes narrowed. "That can be arranged." He pulled out his phone, and in a matter of seconds, the sound of heavy boots echoed through the house. Armed men poured down the stairs, blocking every exit. "No!" Grace lunged forward, but rough hands grabbed her, forcing her back. Emma screamed, trying to run to her mother, but was snatched up by one of the men. "Let her go!" Lily shrieked, struggling wildly, but there were too many of them. "Take them," Mr. Daniels ordered, his voice icy, "and make sure the girl is delivered safely. The mother is expendable." "No, please don't," Grace sobbed, helplessly reaching for Emma as they dragged her away. "She's just a child." "Exactly," Mr. Daniels murmured, watching as the men hauled them up the stairs. "And in a few days, she'll be in our care." They were thrown into a locked room upstairs, the door slamming shut behind them. Lily was on her feet in an instant, pounding on the door. "Let me out! Let her go! Please!" "Lily, stop!" Grace cried, grabbing her. "You'll hurt yourself." Lily whirled around, eyes wild with desperation. "They're gonna take her, Grace. They're gonna take my baby." "I know," Grace whispered, her own fear clawing at her throat. "But we can't let them. We have to." Suddenly, the sound of gunfire rang out from somewhere above. Lily froze, her eyes widening. Then, with a roar, the door burst open, and a familiar figure stormed inside. "Get down!" Mrs. Peterson yelled, a shotgun clutched in her gnarled hands. The old woman's face was fierce, her eyes blazing. "Come on, girls, we're getting out of here." Lily stared, stunned. "Mrs. Peterson, there's no time. Move!" she barked. Without another word, they bolted for the door. Grace grabbed Emma, clutching her tightly as they raced down the hall. Behind them, the sound of shouts and gunfire echoed through the estate. "We're almost there," Mrs. Peterson gasped as they reached the front door. "Hurry!" But as they burst out into the yard, Mr. Daniels stepped out of the shadows, a pistol in his hand. "Going somewhere?" he sneered. And then everything happened at once. Mrs. Peterson raised her shotgun, firing a deafening blast. The bullet hit Mr. Daniels square in the shoulder, knocking him to the ground. "Run!" she screamed. They ran, the darkness swallowing them as the house erupted in chaos behind them. But they were free, for now. The headlights of Mrs. Peterson's beat-up old station wagon cut through the darkness as it sped down the winding road away from Rosewood Estate. The cold wind whipped through the broken window, stinging their faces as they huddled together in the back seat, hearts pounding with terror and relief. "Is everyone all right?" Mrs. Peterson shouted over the roar of the engine, her voice firm despite the tremble in her hands as she gripped the steering wheel. Lily clutched Emma tightly, her breath coming in ragged gasps. I think so," she whispered, stroking her daughter's hair as if to reassure herself that Emma was really there, safe in her arms. The little girl was shaking, her face buried against her mother's chest. Grace leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. "They'll come after us," she murmured, watching for any sign of pursuit. "We can't just run forever." "Don't you worry, dear," Mrs. Peterson replied grimly. "I've got a plan." Lily glanced at her sharply. "What plan?" "We're going to someone who can help. Someone who knows all of your father's dirty secrets," Mrs. Peterson said, her gaze steely. "But first, we have to disappear." "Disappear?" Grace echoed, her pulse quickening. "What do you mean?" "Change your names. Change everything," Mrs. Peterson answered flatly. "It's the only way to keep Emma safe." The car sped down the highway, leaving behind the twisted roads and dark woods of Rosewood. Grace exchanged a look with Lily, fear and determination mirrored in her eyes. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, but they would do whatever it took to protect Emma, even if it meant giving up everything. "Where are we going?" Lily asked softly, holding Emma close. "To the one person your father feared more than anyone else," Mrs. Peterson murmured. "His sister, your Aunt Clara." Grace's eyes widened. "Aunt Clara? But I thought she went underground after your father drove her out of the business," Mrs. Peterson interrupted. "But she's still out there, waiting, and she's the only one who can keep you hidden." Aunt Clara. The name was a whisper from the past, a ghost of a woman Grace barely remembered. But if she really was as powerful as Mrs. Peterson claimed, "Then let's find her," Grace said firmly, "whatever it takes." The old woman nodded, her lips set in a grim line. "We'll need to move fast. Once Daniels recovers, he'll have the entire network searching for you." "Will he come after you too?" Grace asked, her voice softening. Mrs. Peterson smiled faintly. "Oh, don't worry about me, dear. I'm old and tough. They'll have a hard time catching me." Lily managed a weak smile. "Thank you for everything." But Mrs. Peterson just shook her head, her eyes darkening. "Don't thank me yet. This is just the beginning." The car roared onward into the night, carrying them toward an uncertain future. It was dawn when they finally pulled up outside a small, nondescript cottage on the outskirts of a sleepy town miles away from the city. Mrs. Peterson led them inside, her steps cautious but sure. Grace held Emma close as they entered, glancing around nervously. The cottage was cozy but worn, the air filled with the scent of old books and herbs. Is this it?" Lily whispered. "For now," Mrs. Peterson replied. She gestured to the sofa. "Sit down. I need to make a call." The women settled on the couch, Emma curled up between them, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. Grace ran a gentle hand through the child's curls, her heart aching. "We're safe now, sweetie," she murmured softly. Emma looked up at her, her gaze solemn. "Are they going to take me away?" "No," Grace whispered fiercely. "Never." Mrs. Peterson returned a moment later, her face grim. "She'll be here soon." "Who?" Grace asked sharply. "Clara," Mrs. Peterson replied. "She's on her way." Grace's breath caught. So it was really happening. They were about to meet the woman her father had considered his greatest enemy, the one person who might be able to protect Emma. A knock sounded at the door, startling them all. Mrs. Peterson moved quickly, opening it just a crack. A tall, elegant woman stepped inside, her long coat sweeping the floor. Grace's eyes widened. "Aunt Clara?" she breathed. The woman's gaze swept over them, cool and assessing. "Grace, Lily." Her eyes softened slightly as they landed on the small figure beside them. "And you must be Emma." The little girl blinked up at her, wide-eyed. "Are you going to take me away?" she whispered. Clara's expression tightened. "No, child. I'm going to make sure no one ever takes you anywhere you don't want to go." Grace exchanged a look with Lily, hope flickering for the first time. "Can you really help us?" she asked quietly. Clara's lips curved in a faint smile. "I can do more than that. I'm going to make sure those men never lay a finger on you again." Over the next few days, Clara's team moved swiftly. New identities were created for Lily and Emma. Documents were forged, trails were erased. But as the preparations were finalized, a new sense of urgency gripped them. Mr. Daniels was closing in. "We need to get out of here," Clara said one night, her voice sharp with tension. "They'll be here within hours." Grace looked at Lily, then down at Emma. "What do we do?" "You go," Clara replied. "I'll hold them off." "No," Grace protested. "We can't just leave you." "You must," Clara interrupted, her gaze fierce. "Take her to the safe house. I'll lead them on a wild goose chase." Lily's eyes filled with tears. "Clara, go," Clara ordered, and so they ran. They piled into Mrs. Peterson's car once more, the engine roaring to life as they sped away from the cottage. As they disappeared into the night, Grace glanced back, her heart twisting painfully. "Will she be all right?" Emma whispered, clutching her mother's hand. "Yes," Lily murmured, brushing away her tears. "She's stronger than all of us." But even as the words left her lips, the sound of gunfire shattered the air. "No!" Grace screamed, twisting around to see the flash of lights in the distance, the glow of the cottage catching fire. Mrs. Peterson drove on, her face set in a grim mask. "Don't look back, girls. We need to keep moving." Tears blurred Grace's vision. Clara had sacrificed herself for them, but they would survive. They had to survive. For Emma. Months later, in a small town far from Rosewood, a young mother and her daughter stepped into a quaint cafe. Lily's hair was cut short, her face free of fear for the first time in years. Emma skipped beside her, a smile lighting up her face, and behind the counter, a woman with dark curls looked up and smiled. "Good morning," Grace said softly. "What can I get for you today?" Lily smiled back, her eyes meeting Grace's with a quiet understanding. "Just a coffee," she replied. "And a muffin for the little one?" "Yes," Emma chimed in, grinning. They were safe, they were together, and somewhere, in the shadowy depths of Rosewood's ruins, Clara's legacy burned on. If you were moved by this story of love, sacrifice, and resilience, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and share this video to inspire more people. Click on the next video that's appearing now. You won't want to miss it.